The ocean. Our island is surrounded by it. We live in the midst of it. Mesmerizing, enthralling, pleasing. Our ocean is unique, a vibrant marine habitat. We have loyal whales who never leave our seas. Turtles who always return to our shorelines. Mangroves sequestering carbon. Dugongs gliding beneath the waves. Seagrass meadows pumping oxygen we breathe. Underwater reefs sheltering marine life. But they're struggling. Coral reefs bleached. Our seabeds scraped over by foreign fishing trawlers. We're depleting our marine life through overfishing. Plastic and chemical waste pollution gush into our oceans. Coastal sand is disappearing. Marine animals killed by dynamite. Turtles entangling in goose nets. Ships colliding with whales. Climate change. Global warming. Oil spills. Coastal construction. Ocean acidification. Ocean's life is draining. We need the ocean. Our survival depends on it. The sea around us is now a hotspot for geopolitics, trade, security, maritime ventures, and crime. Our impact on the ocean matters. Our ocean is our lungs, our hearts, our nerves. Without it, no one can survive. We can only thrive if our oceans survive. Let's strive to be the guardians of the ocean. Let us be the protectors, together, for our ocean.
Conserving blue carbon ecosystems like seagrass, mangroves, and marshlands is important because they store 3 times more carbon than forest and land ecosystems. They also provide jobs and income to local economies, improve water quality, support healthy fisheries, and provide coastal protection. However, it is estimated that half of the global mangrove cover has disappeared in the last 40 years. Did you know Sri Lanka was designated as the global mangrove champion under the Commonwealth Blue Charter? Over the next decade, Dilma Conservation will commit to restore and conserve over 24 acres of degraded mangrove forest in Sri Lanka. We are collaborating with governmental organizations, local communities, educational institutes, and other corporates. We aim to create a replicable model which will restore mangrove and shallow marine ecosystems with socio-economic development by the year 2030. Mangroves are a unique ecosystem, a special ecosystem, and a vulnerable ecosystem. But we can protect the mangroves together.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the World Oceans Day Summit. I will be your moderator for this session. I'm Chaturangi Wickramaratne, and I work as an environment specialist at the Food and Agriculture Organization. So the World Oceans Day Summit is organized by the Pearl Protectors in close collaboration with the Marine Environment Protection Authority, the Blue Resources Trust, and the World Oceans Day Summit Organization. The summit is organized with the intention of providing an educational platform to discuss freely about all aspects related to ocean conservation, and also allowing us to educate ourselves, to inspire us to value and appreciate this incredible marine environment. So you can learn more about this summit at pearlprotector.org. So this specific session will be on seagrasses and mangroves. As you're probably aware, these are two vital marine and coastal ecosystems that provide us with a range of benefits. But over the last 2 decades specifically, the extent of these habitats have diminished and their health has deteriorated over time. So there's a global and a local interest alike to conserve, to find ways to actually conserve, manage, and even restore, and see how we can sustainably utilize these ecosystems. So for this session, to talk about seagrass and mangrove habitats, we have two specialists in the studio with us. You might notice that we don't have a speaker that we originally planned on having to speak about mangroves. That is Dr. MP Kumara from Ocean University. Unfortunately, due to a sudden personal commitment, he couldn't make it today, and he informed us this last evening. But instead of Dr. Kumara, we have another renowned mangrove expert, Professor Sevvandi Jayakody, from a senior lecturer from the Waimbra University, here with us today. She has immense experience working in mangrove conservation and restoration, and we are extremely grateful for her for accepting this invitation very, very last minute and not hesitating to come and educate us on mangroves. Along with Professor Jayakody, we also have our seagrass expert, Mr. Susantha Udagedara from Blue Resources Trust, here with us. And Mr. Udagedara has worked on numerous seagrass conservation projects, and he's also a commissioned member of the IUC and Seagrass Specialist Group. So a warm welcome to both of you. And for our audience, please make sure you submit any questions you have in the comments box in YouTube and the Facebook channels. We will have a dedicated Q&A session depending on the time for about 15 to 20 minutes towards the end of this program. So we will try to answer some of your questions. So without a further ado, I think we can move on to our discussion. And Professor Jayakody, I would like to start off with you to talk a little bit about the distribution of mangrove habitats around the country, and whether there are any specific factors that enable them to grow and thrive in these environments.
Thank you, Chatu. Thanks a lot. I think, yes, the very first slide is going to be the most important slide for us, because when we compiled the 6th National Report to Convention on Biological Diversity, the experts working on mangroves got together to compile this map that you see. Now, of course, they are confined to the sea, and even along the coastline, the two colors that you see there, the blue colors that you see there, indicates how little it is. As you can see, they are confined to few dots. Substantial mangrove patches in the country have diminished over the last 2 decades. Therefore, we are now talking about scattered patches of mangroves. Therefore, it's really important to understand that we are talking about an ecosystem that requires a lot of attention. But then when you look at the map, that also gives you an idea or rather a few clues where they can actually establish themselves. Most of the areas that you see them are either linked to 103 rivers that drain into the sea. That's basically the estuaries that provide ideal ecosystem for mangroves to thrive. But in addition to that, you also see wherever we have the peninsulas, like here in Putlam, and certain areas where we have the bays, we do have mangroves thriving. And along the coastline of Sri Lanka, depending on the ability of the coastline to retain sediments, then also we tend to see some amount of mangroves. But essentially, mangroves thrive where there's sufficient sediment and where there is sufficient salinity being a crucial factor for their survival. Now, coming to mangroves, it's also very important to remember that salinity itself decides the combination of mangroves that you see in a given area. So the level of the tide to how what kind of distance that it comes in shows the tidal fluctuation itself will define the zonation of mangroves. And that essentially differentiates the true mangroves and the associated mangroves. So let me conclude by saying that the true mangroves are the species that are confined to mangrove ecosystems only. You don't see them anywhere else. And our country is bestowed with 21 true mangroves. That's 1/3 of the mangrove diversity. Thank you, Chuck.
Thank you, Professor Jayakody. Moving on to the seagrass habitats, Mr. Udagedara, can you also explain a little bit about the extent of seagrass distribution in Sri Lanka and whether there are any areas where you can find concentrated seagrass habitats in the country? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chaturangi. Thanks for actually, first of all, I would like to thank Pearl Protectors for inviting me for this important event. Actually, if you look at this map, you can clearly identify some of the seagrasses concentrated areas. So there are some research studies done, and the seagrasses was actually calculated. Total seagrasses extent was about the 37,137 hectare or something like that. So it is a comparably larger seagrass extent available in Sri Lanka. Especially that extent is more distributed in 4 districts, like the Mullaitivu has more than 20 hectare, and the Jaffna is a much more bigger seagrasses, like they contributed around 21,000 hectares from the Jaffna. And in addition to that, the Kilinochchi has some small amount, like the around 500 hectares, and the Mana, which is shared with the Gulf of Mannar, so it has a around 30,000 hectare seagrasses. Other than that, some other areas of the Sri Lanka has seagrasses, but they are not very extensive. So this is actually about the extent of the seagrasses. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Udagedara. Professor Jayakody, if we can talk a little bit about, I know you mentioned a little bit about the diversity of the species. Are there any endemic varieties and threatened varieties or rare species that we should be, aware of?
Chatu, when it comes to mangroves, endemisity is not a factor, basically because they're being living in the coastal areas, basically tend to be found everywhere in the Indian Indian Ocean. So we don't have endemic mangroves as such, but certainly we do have threatened species. As I mentioned earlier, when you look at the global mangrove diversity of the world, out of that, having 1/3 of it, or rather 21 species of it, is a very unique in itself, because when you look at the countries where you find mangroves, not every country can talk about the diversity of that nature. We are very rich with diversity. And among those species, certain species have very interesting distribution. For an example, what you call black mangrove in English, or in Sinhala Kalukadol, in scientifically Scyphiphora hydrophyllaceae, is a threatened species, which is in the IUCN Red List itself, indicating its limited patchy distribution along in the northwestern province. And then when you look at species like Cereops decandra, it's a very interesting species because it's the other species in that same genus, Cereops stadel, is found all around the country, whereas Cereops decandra is found in Kilinochip, Trincomalee area. So it has a very limited, restricted distribution. The same thing can be told about some common mangroves also. When you look at Rhizophora, we have Rhizophora, two species of Rhizophora, but then their distribution is very unique because one species is very much confined to, I would say, the wet and the intermediate zone, Rhizophora apiculata, whereas Rhizophora mucronata prefers more drier conditions. So that's a very important point because when we look at mangrove patches, rather the mangrove habitats, no two patches are unique because their composition, their distribution is determined by the physical and the chemical factors available, and also where they are distributed. Where they are distributed, is it in the dry zone, or is it in the intermediate zone, or is it in the wet zone? So my simple summary of that is, yes, although we don't have endemics as such, we have species that have restricted range distribution. Also, we have species that have gone into conservation, that are with the conservation status.
Thank you, Professor Jayakody. Moving on to seagrass habitats, Mr. Udagedara, can you also tell us a little bit about the seagrass species found in the country? And also, I would like to ask whether there are any special environmental factors that also play a role in their distribution.
Actually, extensive seagrass meadow have been recorded in the northwestern side of Sri Lanka, extending from the Dutch Bay in the Kalpitia to western end of the Jaffna Peninsula, from the Mannar northwest across the Pork Bay and the Rameswaram Island on the Indian coast. In addition to that, the seagrasses are mostly occupying in the shallow areas with the less wave current. So, apart from that, the species are actually more preferred to the muddy habitat rather than the sandy habitat. Some species actually restricted to limited area. So, I will give some hit on the diversity of the species actually. So, if you look at the seagrasses research history of the seagrasses research in Sri Lanka, it ran more than 200 years ago. Very first evidence was the herbarium sheet that was collected from the 1826 from the Puttalama Lagoon. So the one of the seagrass species called the Thalassia hemperechi sample was collected and deposited to the National Herbarium during that time. So if we look at the seagrass species diversity, globally there are 72 species are available, but currently there is an international red list going on, and so they actually took one more additional species to the species list, and now it's a 73 species. And the if you look at our country, we have 15 true seagrass species belong to 7 genera. If you consider about the global seagrass distribution, they divided into the some specific distribution range that's called the bioregion. So globally, there are 7 bioregions are available, and the VIA belongs to the Indo-Pacific bioregion, and the Indo-Pacific bioregion has a high seagrass diversity. And the if we consider about the Sri Lankan seagrasses, as I told that we have 15 seagrass species were there. And the if you look at the composition of the seagrasses, which represent the more than 65% of the Indo-Pacific bioregion seagrasses. So it means that we have a high diversity in Sri Lanka. So in table, you can see that what are the species recorded in seagrasses recorded in Sri Lanka. Like the first one is the Enhalus acredius. It is a very long, lengthy one, and the under the Halopila genus, there are 7 species were recorded, like the Beccaria pensis ovata, minor, major, and Stapulaceae. Under the Cymodocea, 2 species were recorded, and the under the genus Halodule, 2 species were recorded. In addition to that, we have some other marine species like the Syringodia mysothofolium, and the one species especially dedicated. They are mainly prefer in hyposaline condition. That is species called the Rupia maritima and the Thalassia hemperchi also there. So if you look at the research seagrasses checklists in the Sri Lanka very recently, so there were 2 species were added to the Sri Lankan checklist. Namely Halopila stapulacea and the Halopila major. And among these species, actually, Halopila beccari considered as a critically endangered species due to its restricted area of occupancy, because we only found limited area of that species, especially Walachain area and the Negombo Lagoon only. So therefore, with the limitation of that area of occupancy, that species were ranked as the critically endangered species as per the Red List 2020 flora. So that's the distribution actually. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Udagedara. And moving on to like some of the services and goods provided by these ecosystems, they, of course, their extent is not that vast, but they play a massive role in providing regulatory and goods and services for the communities. And they service like only the coastal communities will experience the immediate impacts of the degradation of these ecosystems, but even the inland communities over long periods of time will suffer due to the deterioration of these mangroves and seagrass habitats. So I would like to ask maybe Professor Jayakody, you can start off by saying what sort of important ecosystem services are provided by mangroves, given that about 90% of our national catch comes from marine fisheries.
So, Chatu, although mangroves are not seen by the people that seems to be that lives in the mountainous areas, one very important service of the mangroves is the retention of sediments. All the 103 rivers basically carry everything that erodes from the mountains straight to the sea. And the last chance for any island to retain its soil and sediments back is the presence of mangroves, where at that particular moment when the rivers meander, when the rivers slow down, the heavy load of sediments get a chance to settle down. Now imagine in the absence of such a service, what would be the fate of agriculture in this country? What would be the fate of our coastal configuration? So that's something that we always need to remember when we talk about mangroves. In addition to that, this is a very unique habitat, basically because the tides bring in saline water, and where mangroves are found along with the rivers bring in fresh water. So the brackish water that is formed has the characters of both the saline water and the fresh water. And that has created an environment where both the marine species and freshwater species could from time to time enter for certain life stages of their life. Especially the mangrove roots, as mangroves have very unique adaptations to stand erect in sort of like silky substrate. They have prop roots and stilt roots and many other numerous roots that creates ideal hideouts for any tiny animal. So it's an ideal environment to to be used as breeding grounds. So we have numerous fish and crustaceans that tend to come to do their sort of complete their breeding cycle, as the little ones can sort of like grow with minimal disturbance from the, predators. So that's a very, very important service. So essentially, where mangroves are found, they are the kind of the recruitment ground. So without recruitment, you can't talk about fisheries. So the presence of healthy mangroves in an area is also a very good indicator of healthy fishing. So that's one very important service that we always need to remember. Setting that aside, because that's visible, something that is visible, then I'm moving on to the other thing that is something that is not visible. If you happen to have gone to a mangrove ecosystem, you must have seen, despite the presence of a lot of trees, every time the ground seems to be like as if it's nicely swept. That's basically because of the crabs and other burrowing species that tend to utilize the leaves for their consumption. Basically, what really happens is that the carbon that is produced, rather than being washed off, is taken by these species and then basically deposited in the system itself. So mangroves are ideal habitats to sequester carbon. In another ways, it's an ecosystem that ensures the vulnerability to climate change is taken care of. So that's another important service that it renders. But one more important thing, because we are an island nation, is the service of mangroves in terms of curbing damages due to storm surges and tsunamis. Mangroves have the capacity to mangroves have the capacity to ensure that the velocity of tides, storm surges, tsunamis are mellowed down so that the impact is not felt into the inner parts of an island. Very importantly, mangroves also have another very important job, and we don't tend to appreciate it. Now, in Sri Lanka, something very unique is that our paddy fields go straight into coastline. If you happen to be traveling towards the north, you might have seen, especially in areas like Vidakkalapiu, you see that the paddy fields go straight into the coastline. That's basically because mangroves act as a barrier, effectively ensuring that salt does not enter inland, so that the agricultural systems like paddy cultivation can happen, because mangroves are the barrier stopping soil extrusion into the inland area. So likewise, I can continue telling about the services. I've been talking about few services, but more than anything, if you happen to have sort of spent some time amongst mangroves, you know what a calming environment it is. So the value of mangroves, aesthetic value of mangroves, is also something that we have to always appreciate, because when we map the locations of tourism areas in the country, we very clearly, very nicely see how the tourism sector is thriving where the mangroves are. So all these services are there because of the presence of mangroves. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Jayakody. Turning to Mr. Udagedara, can we also speak a little bit about seagrass habitats and the ecosystem services and goods provided by them? I feel like seagrass habitats are like secret heroes, because we can't really see them unless we go diving or snorkeling, but I know, and we all should be aware of the immense services they provide. So if we can talk a little bit about them, Mr. Udagedara?
Thank you very much. Actually, you are very correct, because so what we are seeing is actually so normally when you go somewhere actually invisibly, so therefore rather than that, actually, so there are so much of important ecosystem under the water. So I will explain how actually importance in the seagrasses in terms of ecological services. So seagrasses are actually economical and ecological important due to the function and the service they provided. So there are so many functions and the service they provided. I will pick some of the services they provided. Seagrasses provide the nursery and the feeding ground for many species. You know that some of the endangered species or highly threatened species are mainly dependent on the seagrasses. Especially dugong actually eats 40 kilogram of the seagrasses per day, and some of the species like the green turtle, they eats 2 kilogram per seagrasses per day. So therefore, so many species actually mainly depending on the seagrasses. So it's important for the nursery and the feeding ground as well too. In addition to that, it had the potential to sequestrate the atmospheric carbon rapidly, and the important for the climate change mitigation. I saw that one of the article, and so it shows that if you look at the carbon sequestration potential, seagrass has a carbon sequestration potential 35 times higher than the tropical rainforest. So it's a massive quantity. So it contributed massively for the global climate change reduction. So in addition to that, the seagrasses are hotspot for many species and the foundation for so many larger food webs and the food chain, because the food webs and the food chains are functional unit for ecosystem. So they are mainly operating through the seagrasses. In addition to that, it acting as a buffer for ocean acidification, because ocean acidification is blooming with the climate change and other factors. So therefore, seagrasses are important for a buffer for the ocean acidification. In addition to that, it has an inherent ability to trap the sediment in the water column and clear the water. It is also one of the important thing, because in the land, so with the issue of the land use conversion, so there are so many sediment particles are coming to ocean and the coastal area. So seagrasses are acting as the trap the particulates matter of that water column, and they seagrasses are try to purify water as much as possible. In addition to that, the seagrasses are acting as the diseases control agent, especially for the, so they control the pathogenic bacteria, especially if we consider about the seagrasses. So they reduce the more than 50% of the pathogenic bacteria coming from the inland. So apart from that, because of the climate-induced disasters, so there are so many storm surge, flooding frequently happening. So seagrasses are helpful reduce that impact impact. So these are the some of the selected services, and so many actually importance are available. So therefore, sometimes you might not be aware about this one. So with the consideration of this importance, especially ecological importance and the economical importance, seagrasses are considered as the third most important ecosystem in the world, followed by the tropical rainforest and the tropical coral reef. So that's one of the very unique environment actually, which provide the ecosystem services and function. So those are the
Thank
importance
you.
actually.
Thank you, Mr. Udagedara. I mean, it's very clear that these are vital for our sustenance. And of course, sometimes the value of these ecosystems are either ignored or not taken into consideration when we are putting together development activities, and that have threatened the integrity of these ecosystems. So if we are to move on to talking about what are the main threats that these habitats face. Maybe Professor Jayakody, we can start from you with mangroves.
Yes, Chatu, if you can actually share that slide with me.
Yeah.
Yeah. Again, what you see now here is a graph that was prepared for the 6th National Report to Convention on Biological Diversity by Minister of Environment. It's a compilation by them. But this is a very interesting thing. What you actually see is essentially mangrove ecosystems in this country can be divided into two broad areas depending on the presence of one particular plant, Nipath fruticans, which is known in known as gainful in Sinhala. Now you see what we have done is to look at the different types of threats. So you see the threat, the severity and the spread, both of it. And as you can see, from area to area, the types of threats are different and that their magnitude is also different. Essentially, few things come in. Pollution. You can see pollution as one of the main reasons that mangroves suffer. So I always tend to say, yes, when there is a disaster that everyone talks about, we tend to sympathize. But pollution happens on a daily basis. Every time during Yala, Maha, the two farming seasons of the country, we have unimaginable amounts of fertilizers, pesticides entering through the riverways into our mangrove ecosystems. Also remember the amount of plastic waste that is dumped, and that the last recipient of most of these pollutants are mangroves because they can easily get trapped and they tend to save. Even with the current disaster that is happening in Sri Lanka with this shift, we already know the nurdles have come and settled in mangroves, especially in Negombo Lagoon. So mangroves are suffering because of pollution. Both solid and liquid wastes enter into the mangrove ecosystems, and that's a big problem. And in addition to that, aquaculture. Aquaculture has been the single most important industry that I can point out as the key reason for the decline of mangroves in this country, both in the northwestern province as well as in the eastern province. Because there was a time when mangroves were considered as just muddy areas, boggy areas, smelly areas, and no one sort of like giving a lot of attention or even not understanding the services it renders. So mangroves were haphazardly removed in order to pave path for aquaculture, and therefore it has got a high severity here, as you can see. And in addition to that, solvents and other developments like the road constructions, urbanization, even the hotels. Many hotels that are looking for scenic spots for their constructions tend to destroy most of our mangrove ecosystem. So that, I would say, can be quoted as main reasons for the destruction of mangroves, but not forgetting invasives. Invasives and their impact is not felt just in the inland ecosystems, but also in coastal ecosystems. If you happen to go to sort of like southern part of Sri Lanka, you will see that invasives such as Dillenia safraticosa are now taking over the river banks, replacing some of our sort of like native mangroves. And then when you go to the north, you can see certain species are now fast invading mangrove ecosystems and salt marshes, and they are taking over mangrove areas. So invasives are a real trouble too. Almost all these things I'm putting into one side, but there is another important point, something that Sixthena pointed out, that is the river diversions. River diversions have single-handedly affected our mangroves. As I told you earlier, there's a certain optimal salinity that got to be maintained with the mangrove ecosystems, and that's only when the true mangroves can survive. But over the years, Sri Lanka has been repeatedly taking water from one basin to the other, from one sub-basin to the other. So in certain areas, the water dynamics have changed. So in certain areas, excessive fresh water is entering into mangrove areas, and certain areas, fresh water is deprived. As a result, our mangroves are changing. So that's something that has been happening, and we had not been paying a lot of attention, but Sixthena very clearly mentioned that's a fact that we have to take into consideration if we are to find solutions how to handle these threats in the country. Thank you, Chatu.
Thank you, Professor Jayakody. Mr. Udagedara, I think Professor Jayakody also touched upon this burning question we all have about the the ship catastrophe and how that might also affect these ecosystems. So, I mean, during the keynote speech, actually, Dr. Tani from MIPA said that they're only now estimating the actual damage to the environment. So, not speculating, but also we should prepare for the worst case scenarios. So maybe, Mr. Udagedara, when you're talking about the threats to seagrasses, you can also talk a little bit about how if these substances, the chemical substances are to be leached or to be discharged into the seagrass environment, how they'll be impacted. Thank you.
Thank you, Chatu. Actually, so I will explain the first. I will explain the global scenario, and then I will move to the Sri Lanka. Actually, so this is actually I sad to say that in the globally, so you can't believe actually this figure. So equivalent to a football field of the seagrasses lost every 30 minutes. So you can't believe actually this figure. So this is the truth actually because of the anthropogenic impacts and the aggravated impact due to the climate change and other impact. So seagrasses are rapidly declining. So, if you look at the Sri Lankan scenario, so Sri Lankan seagrasses are impacted by the many ways, including such as the unplanned coastal development, because sometimes, so most of the people are constructing their development on the close to the seagrass beds, especially in uh, the seagrasses available in very close to the shoreline. So, in addition to that, the most of the seagrasses, especially in the northern province and up to Mana to Jaffna, so they have a huge seagrass. Most of the fishermen are operating boats, and so they are encouraged on the seagrasses. So with the propeller, so it damages so many seagrasses because of they are actually running through the seagrass beds, especially in the intertidal areas. So, in addition to that, the contaminated water discharge from the aquaculture and the salt and another issue. Actually, Professor Jayakody also pointed out that the water discharge from the aquaculture and the salt and because that they discharge the higher chemical loads and the higher concentrated pathogens. So they directly trying to discharge to the seagrasses bed, because most of the Sri Lankan aquaculture farms are closely located, very close to the seagrasses beds. So therefore, that is also one of the biggest obstacle. So in addition to that, we observed that the use of illegal fishing gears like the push nets and other nets are actually being used by the fishermen in the very everywhere actually. So therefore, use of this kind of fishing gears actually could damage the seagrasses a lot. In addition to that, the oil spill, what you already mentioned about the recently, we have oil spill and ship accident, and so it has chemicals, and the some plastic bubbles are also moving to other areas. Actually, I got some news from that it go up to the some level of the Kalpitia area and the down south area. So they actually easily can be deposited into the seagrass bed, because as I explained earlier, seagrasses are acting as the uh, water quality improvement agent, because it trapped the most of the particle from the water. So therefore, the plastic small pellets can be trapped from the that seagrasses around the Minigambo and the Chilawu and either Puttalam or Gulf of Mena area, and it can be retained to their actually mud. And so then I told that several species are depend on the seagrasses for the feeding and the nursery ground, and they can easily can be eaten. And so there are a huge impact will be arisen. In addition to that, so deposited that the particles can be degraded as microplastics, and it can be enter into the seagrass leaves, and then ultimately it end up with the the body of the fish, and ultimately so it's come to the our environment, our body. So those are the huge impact actually we can see as an external threat. So in addition to that, in Sri Lanka, so large scale commercial trawling, so you may have heard about that. So it is happening in the around the Gulf of Mannar area. So it's heavily impacted around the Gulf of Mannar and the Pork Strait, and they actually destroy all the habitat type in the bottom. So because as I told that the extensive seagrass meadows are available in the Gulf of Mannar area, so it is huge impact and it is huge threat. So in addition to that, I told that, all the particles are coming from the streams to that the coastal area, and most of the nutrients are also coming to that area, and sometime algal bloom will be happen. So there was a research study done in the Negombo Lagoon, and it clearly shows that the 20% of the Negombo seagrasses owing to algal proliferation. So therefore, huge impact actually has kind of
Mr. Susantha Udagedara seems to be having some network issues. Professor Jayakody, you're there, right?
I'm there.
Okay. Professor Jayakody, can we talk a little bit about now that most of these mangrove ecosystems seem to be degraded, is there a way that we can rehabilitate or restore some of them, and what makes these efforts successful?
Okay. You are asking that question on a day when we are celebrating World Environment Day. With World Environment Day, the focus for the next 10 years has been set, and that is restoration. We have to also remember, when we start talking about restoration for the next 10 years, what we have been doing in the past, because we are starting new 10 years with a new focus, that's restoration. And before that, the entire world was trying to achieve sustainable development goals as well as Aichi targets. If you look at the biodiversity outlook that is compiled in the last both biodiversity outlook 4 and 5, the documents, you can see globally we did not achieve most of the SDGs, neither the Aichi targets. So that is the base where we are in while we are going into a new decade of restoration. So the first and the foremost thing I want to mention is you simply cannot remove water from a ship with a wall. Same way, as long as you go on talking about restoration without addressing the drivers that cause degradation of ecosystems, we are not going to achieve anything. That's very, very important to remember. So the restoration will be another myth, another opportunity for us to spend billions if we don't address the drivers. So that with that, let me also come to the point of restoration. I would also like to take this opportunity to mention restoration is not replanting. We cannot cut off a pristine ecosystem and say, to compensate for that, we have planted 10,000 trees along the road. That's not restoration. That's not even compensation. Therefore, when you talk about restoration, you have to also always remember, when you look at an environment, there are services, different types of services. There's provision in services, regulatory services, so on and so forth. I wouldn't go into that. Restoration is essentially ensuring all these services that we get from the environment is re-established. Restoration is also not becoming nostalgic of what you lost. because what we lost, we may not be able to re-establish 100%. However, what we have done so far from the research and the field experience that we have got so far, both for mangroves and also Susantha is there for seagrasses, what we understand is it's extremely difficult to do what nature does. But what we can do is follow the clues of the nature and allow nature to restore itself. So the picture that Chatu is showcasing here is one such example where we are trying to allow nature to come back and restore itself. This is some work that the Forest Department is doing off in Narikuda in Mana. You can see all we have done is allowing the water to come, allowing the water to bring the sediments, allowing the water to condition the soil back to normalcy, so that then the nature brings in the right plant and the right seedlings would come in. So restoration is going to be painful, and nature will not do it immediately because what we have, the level of damage that we have done to mangroves is extensive. So the process itself will involve deep understanding why certain degraded area is no more house in mangroves, why is it not providing the services it should render, and then working around to ensure that it happens. So Chatu, if you can go to the next slide, please.
Please,
Not
the
that,
previous
not
one.
That one.
The one before.
The previous
the one before.
Yeah, the one before. Thank you
Yeah.
very much. Now here it's a very classic example. This is in Anivilundava. You can see all that was done is breaking a dike or a bunt of a shrimp farm to ensure that the water flows again. So that later the system will take over by the naturally established in seedlings. So restoration requires citizens to work together. Restoration requires lots of knowledge. Unfortunately, although we are declaring the next decade as era of restoration, studies, scientific evidence for good restoration models are lacking. So Sri Lanka, as champion for mangrove restoration and livelihood, will have a massive task to do. We have to work with the rest of the world, Commonwealth countries, and the rest of the world to look for viable models that would enable us not to replant but to restore ecosystems fully, but also to make sure that communities then would understand the benefits of it and the livelihoods are also restored. For me, Chatu, restoration is restoration of ecosystem plus the restoration of livelihoods around it. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Jayakody. That was very interesting, in fact. Do we have any questions from the audience? Please feel free to submit some questions if you have them. We would have to wrap up soon, but before that, sorry, Mr. Udagedara, we shifted to Professor Jayakody because we lost connection with you. But if you could also talk a little bit about whether it's not very common, is it, to have seagrass rehabilitation or restoration projects? If there are, have they been successful?
Actually, this is a tricky, tricky topic actually. So because so the seagrass replantations will be done underwater. So therefore, so it's a very challenging environment. So because rather than the other restoration doing in the land, actually it's a very tricky because we need to fight with the currents and we need to fight with the so many things. So therefore global scientists were designing some the protocol for restoration. So but so they actually they found that the successfulness is very low in terms of survivalness, because it's very difficult to restore the seagrasses because normally the thumb rule is actually so if you replant 1 hectare of seagrasses, normally cost is around the 250,000 USDs. So therefore it required so much of money for restoration. So therefore, what was actually done was actually scientists came together and they developed some model by using the technology and some other ecological factors, and they have came up with the one idea called the seeding technology, because it's similar to the method actually we are applying for paddy field. So it has promised for higher rate of survival also. So therefore, so it has been already practiced by the Australia and some of the European countries, and it has a higher survival rate. In addition to that, the traditional transplanting actually is actually not very much popular in the globally now, because many of the scientists are actually looking for higher survival rate restoration. So so if you look at the restoration, before that it need to identify the area, and it need to do some ecological study, why that seagrasses has been declared, and by giving the answering to that the threats, so we can replant. That's the protocol actually global peoples are doing. So most of the countries like the Australia and the European countries are actually doing this one. And in addition to that, it required the extensive monitoring mechanism, because if we replant underwater, we have to have a monitoring mechanism at least 1 year, because that it's a challenging environment. So therefore, how the restoration actually, that's the restoration process going on the globally. And Sri Lanka, we are actually trying to establish one seeding nursery in Sri Lanka with the support of Australian CSIRO Australia. And sometime, so we hope to get some success story after the restoration to be done. So those are the things actually we can say, like, for the
Thank you,
restoration.
Mr. Udagedara. That's very good news, actually, that they're trying to do a seagrass restoration project in Sri Lanka. So we hope to hear good outcomes from that as well. So sadly, although there are a few other questions that I would have liked to ask, and we could have continued this discussion for a longer time, but we have to wrap up now. So I would really like to thank our exclusive patron, the EU delegation in Sri Lanka, and the summit patron, Dilma Conservation and Heels, and supporting patron Plasticycle. This has been a very enlightening session and very informative one. Who learned about these ecosystems as much as I did, and I hope you have a newgrown appreciation towards these ecosystems as well. So please do stay tuned in for the next session on threatened species, which will be starting in another 15 minutes. And thank you very much for our experts, Professor Sevvandi Jayakody and Mr. Susantha Udagedara, for taking some time off your busy schedules to be here with us and to share your knowledge. Thank you very much. And to all our viewers and our specialists, have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chadu.